Hi class, this is the sixth video in the series Introduction to Literary Theory, and the topic of this video is going to be New Historicism. So we'll start by talking a little bit about cultural studies. New Historicism is a facet or branch, if you will, of cultural studies. The term culture, in its broadest sense, refers to the shared beliefs, institutions, behavioral norms, and artistic production of a group of people. So literature then is just one of many kinds of artifacts that give us insight into a particular culture. Literature is no more or less important than other kinds of objects and texts. So in the field of cultural studies, ephemeral documents like, for example, personal letters, or ledgers of book publishers, library circulation records, those kinds of documents have just as much interest and value as canonical literary texts. Cultural studies critics are particularly interested in examining how social pressure, social conflict, and differences between people can shape or challenge cultural norms. New literary historicism goes a step farther than the reader response criticism that we looked at last time. Reader response criticism, we talked about how it decentered the literary text to consider the role of the reader in developing meaning. New literary historicism, goes a little bit farther. It rejects entirely the traditionally privileged status of literature as a cultural artifact. For the new historical critic, the artistic merit of literature is far less important than the insight that the text offers into the society that produced and consumed it. So the genius of Shakespeare's plays, for instance, matters less than what those plays can tell us about Shakespeare's Elizabethan and Jacobean world. So before we talk more about new historicism and what makes it different from traditional history, we'll just identify some of the key figures and texts in the development of this critical perspective. It starts with Clifford Geertz, who was not a literary critic per se. He was an anthropologist and ethnographer, but he did recognize that literary texts could have a significant value for the social sciences, for studying a culture. He argued that anthropology had been limited by a methodology that was too focused on observation and description of social behavior, and he wanted to understand not just what people do, but the reasons why they do it. And in order to do this, he says one has to understand the social and cultural context that gives actions meaning. And he called this thick description. And he developed this idea in this book, very influential book called The Interpretation of Cultures, which appeared in 1973. And this idea of thick description would be adapted by scholars to bring new understanding to literary texts. So you might think about how earlier literary critics, like say the New Critics, for example, had been focused entirely on the literary text in isolation from its material and cultural surroundings. The new historicists, on the other hand, see that this contextual information, they see it as vitally important to understanding the text. Another important figure in the development of new historicism, Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher. He died in 1984. He was a student of the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, whom I talked about in the video on Marxist literary criticism. He's not so much interested in the history of events, but the history of ideas. And in his books, he uses terms like genealogy and archaeology to describe this kind of history. He was interested in how discourse and by discourse, what I mean is the linguistic manifestations and dissemination and implementation of ideas. He was interested in how discourse shapes the epistemes that control human behavior and structure society. He was particularly interested in discourse that categorized people and social behaviors, and discourse that shifted power between different groups. So we see this in his books. So, for example, he was interested in discourse about mental illness, and this was his first book, Madness and Civilization. It was actually based on work that he did for his doctoral dissertation, which appeared. It was published in 1961, and then translated into English in 1964. He was also interested in criminality and the penal system, and he published Discipline and Punish in 1975. It was translated into English in 1977. And he was also interested in discourse about sexuality, and both heteronormative sexual behavior as well as behavior pegged as deviant or perverse. And this book came out in 4 volumes. Actually, the 4th volume came out posthumously very recently. The first 3 came out between 1976 and 84 and were translated into English in that same period. I have not yet taken a look at the 4th volume. So this is Stephen Greenblatt, who was among the first to take the ideas of Geertz and Foucault and apply them to literary text. He is currently the editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and his principles have had a tremendous influence on shaping what we think of today as the literary canon. He used the term New Historicism for the first time publicly in a special issue of the scholarly journal Genre in 1982, which he edited, and it contained articles by different scholars applying this new methodology to literary texts. His own work was in the field of Renaissance studies. He was a scholar of Renaissance literature, and so many of his books focus on Shakespeare and the literary world of Elizabethan and Jacobean England. This is the first one, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, you see here, 1980. And then another one, Shakespearean Negotiations, in 1989. In fact, one of the things you're going to notice here is that many of the seminal texts of New Historicism were written by Renaissance literary scholars. It was really a movement that started in Renaissance studies. Catherine Gallagher, she's closely associated with New Historicism and has collaborated with Greenblatt on different projects. They published a book together on New Historicism in the year 2000, I think. This is she's best known for this book here, Nobody's Story, The Vanishing Acts of Women Writers in the Marketplace, from during the long 18th century, from the Restoration through the Hanoverian period. And what she does is she looks at a handful of women writers, I think Aphra Behn, the novelists Charlotte Lennox and Frances Burney come to mind. And what she wanted to do, the way she talks about these women, is she talks about the social and economic forces that impinged on their writing careers. So kind of an interesting blend of New Historicism and feminist literary criticism. Jonathan Dollimore, I couldn't find a good picture of Jonathan Dollimore, but another Renaissance scholar published a book in 1985, Political Shakespeare. And then he published this book, Sexual Dissidence, in 1991, which is an important book in the field of gender studies, had a moment in the history of gender studies that was quite fertile. Just a year before this, in 1990, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble came out, and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's book, Epistemology of the Closet, came out. Both those came out in 1990. So he was applying the new historicist paradigm to gender studies. And the last writer we're going to talk about, Louis Montrose, another Renaissance scholar, written a lot about Shakespeare and the poet Edmund Spenser. This book is one of his best-known contributions to this field, 1996, The Purpose of Playing Shakespeare and the Cultural Politics of the Elizabethan Theater. So these are the some of the major figures in the early development of New Historicism. So let's talk a little bit now about the difference between traditional history and New Historicism. So traditional history is objective. The historian is supposed to be removed from the past. He should remain invisible. His role is to discover rather than to shape history. Traditional history is comprehensive. So the idea is that the events of the past can be completely known and understood, and that the task of the historian is to reveal the truth of what happened. Traditional history is progressive, so its history can be thought of as a linear series of causes and effects forming a coherent narrative of the advancement of human civilization. And the last one here, exclusionary. I don't think historians would think of themselves as exclusionary, but the historian in the traditional history relies on privileged documents and artifacts. Alternative voices and perspectives are ignored, diminished, or consciously suppressed. So how is New Historicism different from traditional history? So let's talk about that. So I'm going to move these qualities to the left. And if traditional history is objective, New Historicism is subjective. If traditional history is comprehensive, New Historicism is contingent. If traditional history is progressive, the New Historicism is discursive. And traditional history being exclusionary, we can think of the New Historicism as being inclusive. And let's talk a little bit about what I mean by these terms. So when I say subjective, the historian's own beliefs, values, and material circumstances affect his interpretation of the past. The historian is not invisible, but rather a conscious participant in the making of history. And one of the terms presented in our textbook on this is self-positioning, that the historian is sort of conscious of the way that his or her own context shapes the way that they construct historical narratives. By contingent, what I mean is that history is a narrative construct, and therefore it's contingent on a narrator. History is not a truth waiting to be discovered out there somewhere, but it's always in process and therefore can never be final or complete. This might remind you of Bakhtin's idea of unfinalizability. Well, that's a tough word to say. Unfinalizability. By discursive, what I mean is that the objective of history is not to form a grand narrative illustrative of the progressive advancement of civilization. Rather, it is to understand how different groups of people, in particular those excluded from traditional historical narratives, were affected by events and the discourses, and how they were affected by the discourses of hegemonic culture. And finally, the New Historicism is inclusive. The new historian privileges documents and artifacts that are overlooked in traditional histories. So they're drawn to not just overlooked documents and artifacts, but they're drawn to alternative perspectives and subaltern voices that challenge hegemonic discourses. So that's the difference between traditional history and new historicism, and these different priorities and qualities shape the criticism of literary texts, those who identify with this particular school of criticism. And that concludes this video on new historicism.